Thank you, Liz. It's great to be here. It took us a while to find a date, so I'm really glad we were able to do that and that it's worked out and that you're all able to be here. What I'm going to talk about is mainly in the realm of what's called parapsychology. Parapsychology is not as all-encompassing as some people think. It basically has to do with the scientific study of things that we might consider psychic or paranormal. And so that's, as a statistician, that's my expertise. I'm not an expert on some of the things that can't be studied scientifically or that are not included as part of that. Let me tell you a little bit about myself first, just to tell you how I got involved with this area. I have a Ph.D. in statistics, and as most of you probably think, it's a pretty dry subject, and most people who work in statistics do what even I would consider pretty boring stuff. But I had the opportunity, when I was on sabbatical at Stanford University, to branch out into this really fascinating area that I'm going to talk about today. And I did that through meeting people that were working on this secret government project called remote viewing. So I'm going to talk a lot about that today. But I want to set the stage first. I want to talk more generally about what most of us would call psychic kinds of events, and just distinguish a little bit what different modalities people talk about. So how many of you think you've had a psychic experience of some kind? Okay, so maybe about half of you, or maybe a little more than half. One of the things that's really difficult if you don't study things scientifically is to distinguish coincidence from a true psychic event. So I'm going to tell you a little story of something that happened to me, and we can think about which it might have been. I was in New York City visiting, and I had gone to college in New York State. So I was with my partner, who's now my husband, and we were walking down the street in Greenwich Village, and I started thinking about somebody I had gone to college with that I had lost touch with, and she had a fairly common name, and it was before, Facebook and all those things, so it's not like I could just Google her or look her up on Facebook. So I was telling my partner about this, and I said, it would be great if I could find her and get in touch with her, because I really would like to maintain contact. So, but I have no idea how to find her. And she has a common name. And all I know is she's a lawyer somewhere in the New York City area. I don't even know where. And we walked around the corner, and there she was. And then she said to me, "Oh my God, Jessica, I was just thinking about you." Okay, so if I had just bumped into her coincidentally and had not just been talking about her, I would just simply call that a coincidence. But the fact that I had just said I would love to find her makes it a little bit more interesting of a story. But now let's talk about the different forms of psychic phenomena that people have differentiated over the years. So one is what's called telepathy, which is the idea of mind-to-mind communication. So it's possible that it was that somehow, she and I were communicating before we rounded the corner and saw each other. Another one is clairvoyance. So clairvoyance is where you perceive something that somebody else isn't already thinking about. It's just an object or something out there. So maybe I psychically saw that she was there, but the mind-to-mind part wasn't any part of it. And then the third is precognition. So maybe I went into the future and saw that I was going to bump into her and then started talking about her. So as weird as these things sound, those are all different possible explanations, and we can't really differentiate when there is something that's an alleged psychic experience, which one of those it is, or if it's just a coincidence, or more recently, people are talking about something even weirder, which is the idea of some sort of correlation among events. So this has to do with quantum mechanics, that if you separate two particles, they're now at a distance, and you tweak one of them in a certain way, the other one reacts faster than the speed of light communication would allow that to happen. So this is called spooky action at a distance by some people. And it's a weird feature of quantum physics that nobody really understands. So maybe there's some sort of interconnectedness among all of us, and that people are all tapping into some common kind of source or whatever. So we don't know what's going on. And most of the research in the lab has been geared toward, in the past, until very recently, has been geared toward just seeing whether or not we could prove that psychic abilities exist at all. and we call that proof-oriented research. More recently, people have been working on what they call process-oriented research, trying to figure out if it is real, how does it work? So that's been very intriguing. My bet right now is either the last thing I explained to you, the quantum mechanics stuff, or precognition, that it's all explained through the fact that we all eventually get to see our own future, and maybe we can tap into that through reasons that physics would ultimately explain. So who knows what's going on. All right, so that's just the basics. I want to read you a story. Again, stories are more fun than just dry scientific stuff. So I want to read you a pretty startling story about precognition from a book by Larry Dossey, who's a MD and has written about some of these things. This particular book is called The Power of Premonition. And his argument is that we probably all have premonitions and that we should act on them because they sometimes could help us. And so this example is one example of who knows what would have happened if people had acted on I mean, there's no way people could have acted on the things that I'm going to tell you, but there are similar circumstances and stories in his book where individuals could and sometimes did act on things and probably prevented the disaster. So let me read you this particular one. For that, I need these. And it's about a place called Aberfan. Have any of you heard of the Aberfan disaster? Okay, so I won't be repeating a story you heard. Okay, so I'll just start. I want to read directly rather than trying to explain it because it's easier that way. I'll say coal mining and death have always kept close company. In 1906, the Quarries mine disaster, Europe's worst mining accident, killed 1,099 miners, including many children, and so on. He talks about different ones. Okay. Coal miners are not the only victims of mining accidents, which the village of Aberfan, Wales, discovered on Friday, October 21st, 1966. At 9:15 a.m., a mountain of coal waste that had long loomed above the town broke loose. Destabilized by recent rains, a river of black coal, sludge, water, and boulders flowed into Aberfan with the vengeance of a mass murderer, crushing or suffocating 144 people, including 116 children. First to be killed were the occupants of a cottage high up on the slope. Next in its path were the children and teachers at Pantglass Junior School, who had just returned to their classroom after singing All Things Bright and Beautiful at their assembly. Before the black monster came to rest, it engulfed 20 more houses. There was total silence. As George Williams, who was trapped in the debris, recalled, in that silence you couldn't hear a bird or a child. Okay, so mine employees stationed up on the slope who were responsible for monitoring the mountain stability had seen the avalanche start but could not sound the alarm because their phone had been stolen. The landslide happened so quickly that nobody down below saw anything. Everyone heard the noise, however. It was a tremendous rumbling sound, and all the school went dead, recalled 8-year-old student Gaynor Minette. You could hear a pin drop. Everyone just froze in their seats. I just managed to get up, and I reached the end of my desk when the sound got louder and nearer until I could see the black out of the window. I can't remember any more, but I woke up to find that a horrible nightmare had just begun in front of my eyes. As word of the horrific event spread, people all over Wales dropped what they were doing, threw a shovel in the car, and drove to Aberfan to help. They discovered that about half the students at the school had died, along with 5 of their teachers. And after 11 a.m., nobody was rescued alive. It was almost a week before all the bodies were recovered. So the reason I give you all those details is to point out that this was a big event in that area, just like, as I'll continue reading here, Aberfan remains a defining moment in Welsh history, has become part of England's collective memory. The event shook the entire nation, like Americans who remember where they were and what they were doing when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, or when they first heard of the September 11 tragedies. Most British people born before 1960 recall the 1966 Aberfan disaster in the same way. Okay, so now here comes the precognition part. Within weeks of the Aberfan disaster, reports of premonitions began to surface from all over Wales and England. 14 months after the tragedy, many of them were published in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research in a paper authored by Dr. John Barker, a psychiatrist near Aberfan. He had persuaded a local newspaper to run an article to solicit any premonitions people might have had about the calamity. He received 76 letters, and although many of them were vague, he selected 35 that seemed possibly valid. In 24 of those, the respondents had related the information to someone else before the avalanche occurred, which is important if you're going to try to kind of verify, right, that the memory was correct. In the promising cases, Barker obtained the names and addresses of family members and friends who might substantiate or discount the report, and he interviewed them as well as the initial letter writers. In many of the reports, dreams were involved. In one case, the dreamer saw the word Aberfam spelled out in huge, brilliant letters. In another dream, a telephone operator from Brighton talked helplessly to a child who walked toward her, stalked by a billowing cloud of black dust or smoke. Most of the ones who responded to the request did not live near Aberfam. They had never heard of it, and they had no connection with it. But, okay, so here's my sort of, I don't know if favorite's the right word, but sort of most eerie one here. 10-year-old, it says, but 10-year-old Earl May Jones, the only known Aberfam student to have had a premonition of the disaster, had told her mother before the devastation, "Mummy, I'm not afraid to die." And her mother responded, "Why do you talk of dying and you so young? Do you want a lollipop?" "No," she said, "but I shall be with Peter in June." The day before the devastation, she said, "Mummy, let me tell you about my dream last night." "Darling, I've no time to listen," her mother said. "Tell me again later." "No, Mummy, you must listen," she persisted. "I dreamt I went to school and there was no school there. Something black had come down all over it." Okay. The child was killed the next day, was buried in a communal grave with two friends who also lost their lives, Peter on one side, June on the other side. The story was put together by a local clergyman and was verified and signed by both the little girl's parents as correct. And then there's a little more, but that one to me was particularly startling because I think it points out something that we don't pay enough attention to, and that is that children often have these experiences and we just kind of dismiss them because we think they don't know what they're talking about. So maybe we should listen more to children. And by the way, I should say experiments on children have not really been done because it's very difficult. You have to get parents' permission and so on with current informed consent to participate in experiments. But the ones that have been done have been promising. Okay, now I'm going to talk about something more specific, which is the experiments that we've done to test this stuff. So that, as I said, is what would be considered parapsychology. And what's not part of parapsychology is things, people tend to kind of lump all this stuff together. So, UFOs, Bigfoot, all those kinds of things people sort of come up and talk to me about. So that's not parapsychology. Those are not things we can test in the laboratory. But we can test the kinds of alleged abilities that I've been talking about. So telepathy, precognition, et cetera. Okay, so I'm going to define, actually, let me move a little bit. Okay, let me tell you first about the government program, some details of it, and then I'm going to go back and talk about some specifics. So the most recent part of the government program, and again, I'm going to be reading a little here, so forgive me for that, but the most recent part of the government program was called Stargate. And Stargate was the code name. Most government secret programs have code names. Stargate was the code name, but it's the one it got to be known by. So there have been quite a few TV shows and other publicity now about the Stargate program. So what I'm going to read you is directly from the person who ran that program. He's a no-nonsense physicist, materialist named Ed May. And so he still works in this area, even though the government program was shut down in 1995. So rather than misquote him on what was going on behind the scenes, I'm going to read some stuff that he shared with me. So the government program had three purposes, and I will intervene to give my own personal opinion on some of this stuff. The first one was to gather intelligence. The second one was to assess the threat of other countries who might be using this against us. And the third was to do both basic and applied research. It was funded from 1972 through 1995. It started out at the Stanford Research Institute, which used to be connected with Stanford University, no longer is. It's now called SRI International instead. And it was funded there from 1972 to 1989 for a total of $17 million. It had 3 to 12 full-time staff members during that time, more or fewer at different times. In 1990, it moved over to SAIC, which is another think tank, basically, and it continued until 1995, and at that point was funded with $4 million and 5 full-time staff. There were there remain approximately 100,000 pages of classified material that came out of that. So maybe 10% of it's been declassified, but most of it remains classified. There were about 25 peer-reviewed papers that came out of it, some of which I co-authored. And some of those didn't get published till after it was declassified, after it had ended. And okay, so now some secrets from the past and present that Ed goes through. From 1972 till 1989, so the whole time it was at SRI International, we could not, and I was working there, and I'll explain my part of it, we could not admit that there was this intelligence activity going on. So people really didn't know what we were doing, our little unit. SRI is a huge company. It's got like, I don't know, thousands of employees, and we were a little group of, at the time I was there, maybe 10 people. But we were behind locked doors, and we were not allowed to say what we were doing. We were not allowed to name any of the individuals who were involved doing the so-called psychic work. We were not allowed to admit who was funding the work, which changed over the years. Sometimes it was the Army, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the CIA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, so there were different funders over the years. We were not allowed to discuss the results of the foreign assessment, so trying to find out what other countries were doing. Couldn't discuss that. And in 1989 to 1995, all of the research part, so not the other part, not the spying part, but the research part was declassified retroactively, but most of the spying part remains classified. As I said, over 100,000 pages still classified. And some sources of funding have been released, but not all of them. So let me tell you a little bit about how I got involved. As I said earlier, I was, excuse me, well, maybe I didn't say this part of it, but I was doing a sabbatical at Stanford University. I was at University of California, Davis at the time, and I had just gotten tenure, which those of you that know the academic system know means job security. So now I was free to branch out and do things that might be a little bit unusual. So I was at Stanford University, and one of the professors there was asked to do a TV show to critique a study that had been done that alleged that people psychically knew when there was going to be a train crash. This was a paper, a study that had been done looking at train ridership on days when there was a crash versus days when there wasn't, and showed that ridership was lower on days when there was a crash. So I took the bait. I thought that would be fun to be interviewed for a TV show. It was for 2020, the TV show 2020. So I read the paper and I was skeptical. I mean, I was asked actually to find a flaw in the study. So I did. I found that one of the days that they looked at for ridership was Labor Day, because they only looked at Mondays. So one of them was Monday was Labor Day. Well, you can't count that because of course ridership's going to be lower. It was a commuter train route. So I went on TV, I talked about this, but in the meantime, I met the other people that were being interviewed for the show, and I got very interested. And they were psychics, so this show was trying to do a balance. I was the skeptic. So I talked to the guy who had asked me to do the show, who was a faculty member in the Stanford Statistics Department, and he said, well, if you're really interested in this stuff, I can introduce you to somebody who just started an organization called the Society for Scientific Exploration, that's whole purpose is to scientifically study this kind of stuff. So I went and met that guy, and he told me about their upcoming conference. So to make a long story short, I went to the conference, and I met the people at SRI who were doing this work for the government. And they needed a statistician. They said, would you be interested? So I became a consultant for them. And a few years later, I took a leave of absence from my job at Davis, and I went and worked full-time there for a year. And so I kind of got sucked in. So now I'm the world expert in statistical evaluation of parapsychology data, because I'm the only person who does it. Easy to be the world expert when you're the only one. So I got involved that way. And it was very interesting, obviously, very, very interesting. So let me tell you a little bit about what we were doing at SRI. So there were two parts to the Stargate program. One part was top secret classified, one was just secret classified. The top secret classified part was they actually had a group of people who had shown some ability to be psychic, who were targeted with spying on our enemies, or other kinds of, gathering other kinds of intelligence information that our government needed for various reasons. That was called the operational work. There was also scientific work going on, and that's the part where I was evaluating things, in the laboratory where, as I said earlier, we were testing to see whether or not these abilities were real, if so, how they might work, and also, we also wanted to know if the Soviets were spying on us, was there a way to block that so they couldn't get the information? So those are the kinds of things we were doing in the laboratory. The government came up with this term, remote viewing. How many of you heard that term, maybe before today? Okay, good. So before this program started, you wouldn't have heard that term because it didn't exist. So that was coined by the government researchers who were doing this work at SRI. And it was meant to be kind of a neutral term, not have the word psychic or ESP or any of those kinds of things in it. They came up with another term later called anomalous cognition, meaning somehow we're getting some sort of cognition that's anomalous, but we don't want to assign any mechanism to it. Remote viewing still makes it sound like there's a mechanism. You're actually viewing something. Okay? Anomalous cognition is just, we don't know what's going on, but somehow the brain's got information there, okay? So what is remote viewing? Well, remote viewing is a subset or a very limited part of what you might call psychic events or abilities. So one thing that differentiates it is that it's not spontaneous. So remote viewing is that you're actually told there's a task you're going to do right now. It's not that you're walking down the street and think about your friend from college and there she is. Okay, you're actually told you're going to try to describe something that you can't see that's distant from you either in space or time or both. And there's a very strict protocol that goes with remote viewing. Number one is nobody in the room with you knows what the right answer is, because otherwise it would be too easy for them to give you subtle cues. Okay, so very strict. So true remote viewing is there is a place or a time or an event or something that you're going to try to describe. You're given what's called sort of a target information, and that's all you're told. So you might be told, here's an envelope, it has a photograph of a person in it. I want you to tell me where that person is. That's all. You don't even look at the photograph, you're just told. Or you might simply be given a random number, like what I'm going to do with you now. We're going to try it, not quite yet, but I have a bag there of objects, so I'm going to have you try this. And they're in bags numbered 1 to 8. I don't know what's in each bag. I do know what the 8 objects are, but we're going to randomly choose one of them to be the right answer. And I had my husband number the bag. I put the objects in the bags, and I had him number them. So I don't know what's in each bag, and he doesn't know what's in each bag because the objects were already in the bags when I handed them over him to number. So we're going to randomly choose one of them from 1 to 8 and have you try to remote view it. And I'm simply going to tell you, well, we'll decide how we're going to do it. But basically the idea is going to be, there's an object in a bag. Nobody here knows which one it is or what it is. I just want you to try to describe it, and then I'm going to show it to you at the end. So that's basically how remote viewing works. In the laboratory, of course, we can randomly choose what we want to be what's called the target, which is whatever the object is or whatever it is. We can randomly choose it from a larger set, and so we can show it to you at the end. In the operational work, where we were spying on our enemies, the right answer might never be known. So usually there was some sort of feedback eventually, but possibly it might never be known. So still both of those would be called remote viewing. One is the laboratory remote viewing, and the other one is operational remote viewing. Let me give you a few examples from the government work that I can talk about. One was for the, I'm not sure if it was, I think it might have been the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, that targeted this one, but there was a customs agent who had gone rogue. It turned out he was working with the smugglers that were bringing drugs into the United States in Florida. He got caught. They discovered that he was doing this, and so he escaped. He became a fugitive, and they, of course, wanted to find him. So they spent 2 years trying to track him down. The government thought he was probably in the Caribbean because he was into boats, and they thought he's either in a boat out here or he's in the Caribbean or whatever, and they had 2 unsuccessful years trying to find him. So they thought, okay, when all else fails, let's try the remote viewers. So they went to the remote viewers, and a remote viewer, and they had a picture of him in an envelope. They just said, there's a picture of somebody in here. Where is he? That was it. And the person described he's at a campground near Yellowstone. There's an Indian burial ground nearby, and a few other little details. And based on that, they went and found him and captured him. So that's the kind of example of the operational work that was used. There's another example that Jimmy Carter talks about when he was president. There was a plane that had gone down somewhere in Africa, and we could not find it using traditional intelligence methods. So again, they called in the remote viewers, and they were able to locate it. And so Carter talks about that and he acknowledges the source of that information. So there are a couple of things that are difficult about this in terms of use for intelligence work. So one is sometimes you never know if you got it right or not. Two is the remote viewers were usually only called in when all else had failed, and so they were doing the most difficult cases. And yet they were still able to be successful about 20 to 25% of the time, which is pretty good considering that all the other methods had not been able to be successful in those cases. Another reason it's really difficult is that you never know when it's right and when it's wrong. So in other words, until you find the right answer, we've tried to figure out if there's some way that the remote viewer can assess when they're on and when they're not, and they can't. So we just don't know. So you get the answer, and there's no way to know if it's a good one or a bad one unless you actually can find the end result and verify it. So for all these reasons, it's very difficult to use this for intelligence work. And yet, for 20 years, this went on. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but that part was going on at Fort Meade in Maryland. It was not going on at SRI. So, that was the government part. So obviously, if it went on for 20 years, they had to have had some pretty good successes, or it would not have been funded at the level that it was for that amount of time. There were some senators that were very invested in this, who really were keeping track of what was going on and were very tied into having it work and who wanted it to continue. One of them was William Cohen from Maine. Another was Claiborne Powell from Rhode Island, who the students at Irvine and other places are very grateful for creating what are called the Pell Grants, which are the funding that a lot of students get when they go to college. So these were people who were very supportive, and they did not want it to end. So to continue my story, what happened was that in 1995, the Cold War was over, and the Defense Intelligence Agency at that time was funding the program. And they really didn't want it to continue. The Cold War was over. Their usefulness for it, because of the issues that I told you about intelligence work, they decided they really didn't want it anymore. But these powerful senators wanted it to continue. And so a compromise was reached, and that was to do a review of the scientific work and the operational work, do a review for Congress, and answer two questions. One, is it scientifically valid? And two, is it useful for intelligence work? So they hired a consulting firm, AIR, American Institutes for Research, and they subcontracted the scientific part of it out to me and a well-known skeptic named Ray Hyman. And we were to do a report to assess the scientific work that had been done. We were given one summer to do it. We were shipped 3 big boxes full of reports that we were to assess. So there was another group that was supposed to be evaluating the operational work, and apparently they didn't do their job. They left unopened most of the boxes that had the operational work in it. So obviously somebody wanted this program killed. But Ray and I did our due diligence. We wrote our report, which is available on my website, so you can still see it. And we both concluded that there was definitely something statistically valid there, statistically significant, way beyond what you would expect by chance. But Ray, being the skeptic and having built his career being a skeptic, said, but there has to be some other explanation. Whereas I did not say that. And I'll read you, in fact, the conclusion from my report. What I said was, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it's concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. The statistical results of the studies examined are far beyond what's expected by chance. Arguments that these results could be due to methodological flaws in the experiments are soundly refuted. Effects of similar magnitude to those found in government-sponsored research at SRI and SAIC have been replicated at a number of laboratories across the world. Such consistency cannot be readily explained by claims of flaws or fraud. So that was our report to Congress, and they killed the program anyway. Because both Ray and I agreed, and so did Ed May and others, that its use for intelligence work is somewhat limited because of the reasons that I went into earlier. So the government was not interested in the science. They were interested in using it for intelligence gathering. So for that reason, it was killed, apparently. Okay, so let's see. Let me tell you now a little bit about the scientific part, like how you would do a scientific remote viewing, and then we're going to actually try it. But I can't quite do it the way we would do it in the laboratory with you, but we'll still try it and see what we come up with. So the way we do it in the lab, let's say you were to come in, you're going to be the remote viewer, okay? So before you get there, before the experiment even starts, we create a pool of what are called targets. So for example, one experiment, we had 200 photographs taken out of National Geographic magazine. So they were things like, waterfalls, cityscapes, mountains, etc., all those kinds of things. 200 photographs, but here's where the statistical part comes in. Before the experiment started, we separated those 200 photographs into packages of 4, where within a package, the 4 were as dissimilar as possible, unalike as possible, and you'll see why in a minute. So, for example, there might be a waterfall and a mountain and a city and a windmill, maybe. Okay, so 4 as unalike as possible. Okay, you come in, you're going to come in, so before you come in, unless it's a precognition experiment, before you come in, we randomly select one of these packages of 4, and then we randomly select one of those 4 to be the actual target. So now there's been a target selected. You come in, we put you in a shielded room where you can't communicate with anybody through normal means. And we give you paper and pencil like you were given here, since we're going to try it. And you have a monitor sitting across the table from you. This person is called a monitor. Their job basically is to tell you what your task is. Okay, so you're told, put your pen on your paper, and when I say the word target, I want you to just draw whatever comes into your mind first. And the monitor who's in the room with the remote viewer has no clue what the right answer is either, obviously. Okay, so they say the word target, and hopefully something comes into that person's mind that's coming from somewhere else, okay, that allows them to get some information about what the actual target is. So they draw, and then when they feel like they've exhausted what went into their head the first time around, they take a break, they chat a little bit, and then when they're ready to go again, they put their pen on their paper, and the monitor says target, and again, they draw whatever comes in. And so it's kind of like a free word association. You're trying to just get whatever comes in without thinking. You don't want the person to think too much, okay? So when they're done, we take what they've drawn and go make a Xerox copy of it and lock the original away in a filing cabinet so nobody can change it, nobody can alter it. Then we go get whatever the correct answer is, and we take it back and show it to the remote viewer for closure. So now they know what it was they were supposed to be trying to draw. And then, here's the statistical part. We take the 4 targets in that pack that could have been the right answer. Remember, the pack was randomly selected, but more importantly, the right answer within that pack was randomly selected. So we take the 4 pictures, and we call it a target and 3 decoys. Okay, we take those, and we take the drawing that the person made, and we give those to a judge. The judge's job is to try to figure out which of these 4 pictures was the person trying to draw. So what's the probability that they would get it right just by chance? 1 in 4, right, okay? No matter what the person drew, suppose the person always drew a waterfall. Because we randomly selected the right answer, there's a 1 in 4 chance that the waterfall would have been selected as the right answer. So there's a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right just by chance. And instead, what my evaluation found over the years for these experiments was people got it right about 1 in 3. Now, that might not sound like a huge effect, and it's not, but it's, over the years, having done it many times, hugely statistically significant. Okay, so somehow it's a relatively small effect. If it was large, we wouldn't debate whether or not it's real, right? We'd all know it's real. But it's a relatively small effect, but it's consistent. It's across laboratories. It seems to be across sort of people who have never done it before and people who have, and so on. There is a caveat to that, and that is there are a few talented, very talented people who can get it right maybe 50 to 60% of the time. And those are the ones that ended up doing the operational work. Okay, so we're not going to be able to do quite what I said here because I can't give you each an individual target. We're going to all do it together. But we can randomly select it and have it so that nobody in the room knows what the right answer is. So I'm going to give you guys a choice of doing telepathy, clairvoyance, or precognition. So let me explain how each one of those will work. If you choose that you want to do telepathy, we're going to have someone from the audience come up. They're going to take the object out of the room. Then they're going to open the bag and be looking at it while you're trying to draw it. If you choose to do clairvoyance, we're simply going to have the object in the bag, but we'll have already selected which one is the right answer. And I have a way we're going to randomly select the right answer. And if you choose precognition, we're not even going to select the right answer until after you're done. Okay, so how many would like to do telepathy where somebody is out there looking at the object? Okay, I'm not quite counting, but how about clairvoyance where the object's just sitting there, just a few, and precognition? I think the first one was the winner. Okay, so that's going to be the telepathy. So do I have a volunteer who wants to go out of the room to be looking at the object? Okay, how about you in the red? Okay. All right, now we need one more thing, and I'm going to have you do it. Come on up. Okay. So because we're doing this as telepathy, we want a random choice. So what I've got is the cards from a deck. I'm going to have her randomly pick one, and that's going to be the right answer. So I'll give you that bag. You'll go outside the room. You'll open that bag. You'll look at the object. Okay, so let me shuffle these and have you randomly pick one. So she's going to go out of the room, open the bag. She's going to be looking at it, handling it, and so on while you're all trying to draw it. Now, one thing that has been found to help is to have you be in a relaxed state. So we're going to play about a 4-minute meditation that actually I downloaded from the New York Times website, so there's nothing weird about it, obviously. They had an article on doing meditation, and they had some example meditations on there. So we're going to play that and have you relax. When that's done, I'm just going to kind of guide you through a little bit to try to do the remote viewing.
You're about to listen to a 4-minute mindfulness meditation by Tara Brach. Find a comfortable spot and close your eyes. Now listen.
Coming into stillness and feeling the simplicity of your body breathing. Taking a nice, full, deep in-breath now. Extending the in-breath, filling the chest and the lungs. And a slow out-breath, feeling the sensations of releasing the breath, relaxing outward, letting go.
Okay. You can open your eyes now. And I'm going to say the word target. Put your pens to your papers. When I say the word target, I just want you to draw whatever first comes into your mind. And I will just give you a little bit of a hint, and that is that what we find is that sense impressions work best. So things like, is it hard or soft? Pretend you're holding it. What colors do you see? So whole descriptions don't work so well. So because that means your brain is being cognitive and getting in the way. So just whatever sense impressions you get about what might it feel like, what might it look like, just in sense and so on. So you can draw pictures or words or whatever you feel. Okay, so everybody got your pen ready to go? Okay. Target. And I'll just guide you a little more. So pretend you're holding it. Is it hard? Is it soft? What's it made out of? Is it glass or cloth or metal? Do you see colors? Do you see shapes? Just see if you can connect with this object. When she brings it back in, I'm going to pass it around. So just feel yourself holding this object. See if you can get some sense of what it is. Okay, we're going to do about 2 more minutes. Okay. I'm going to go get her and have her bring the object back in. Okay, now no more writing, right? Okay, you ready for the reveal here? It is a coffee mug. It says Mile Zero Key West, green on the outside, white on the inside. Okay, I'm going to pass this around, and then I'm going to ask you who thinks you got something close. So I'm going to start passing it here. Okay. Okay, anybody have anything you want to share that you got? Okay, so the hardest part is judging, right? So I don't know if any of you got anything similar to that, but again, what we would do if this was a real experiment is we would show a judge that object and 3 other objects that could have been chosen as the right answer. We would show them your description. We would say, even if it doesn't match any of them very well, which one does it match best? Okay, did somebody back there get something you wanted? No? Okay. Okay, so how did that experience feel?
Oh, hi. I wrote down glass, green, hard.
Very good. Very close.
White, circular.
Uh-huh, good.
I thought it had a handle. I drew a model of green.
Good, the color, yeah. And again, that's the kind of information that comes through. What do you have?
It's a mug with a flower on it.
A mug with a flower on it, very good.
But I thought it was metallic.
Still, a mug, see, that's the thing. She said a mug with a flower on it, but she thought it was metallic. Again, the sense impressions that come through tend to be bits of information, and we always tell people, don't try to put it together into, a whole gestalt, because you're going to probably put it together wrong. So like, let's say a remote viewer says, I see the Empire State Building. We would say, what is it that makes you think that? Like, is it a shape you see? Is it, whatever. So the idea is that whatever this is, it's probably not a high-level cognitive functioning ability, or, we would use it more in that way. So whatever it is could very easily be some sort of primitive ability that we have before we had language, for instance, that we maybe needed at some point that we don't need so much anymore because we now have better means of communication. So whatever it is, we don't know, but we do know that as soon as somebody has a high-level cognitive answer, it's probably not right. I will give you one example where that wasn't true, because I think this is a really interesting story, and it is part of my history. It's part of what intrigued me enough to stay involved in this area after I first got involved, and that is, there was a lab that was doing similar research in Princeton. This was right after I had gotten involved in this area, and I was still skeptical. And my parents lived in southern New Jersey, so I asked my father, who I knew was interested in this stuff, if he would like to participate in an experiment. So he and I went together to the lab in Princeton. Even I lived in California, but I was visiting, and I introduced him to the people and so on. And he got signed up for an experiment that involved going 4 times to this lab to do this thing. So the first time he went with somebody else. The second time, sorry, I missed one thing here. The way this lab worked, there was always a sender. So it was like we just did, there was always somebody looking at the answer. Okay. So my father went, and he went with somebody else. I wasn't there. I was in California. And the target that he got was a picture of the Kremlin. And so he and I were driving to Princeton for the second visit, and he was explaining to me what happened during the first visit. And he said, well, I was in the room where I was supposed to be psychic or whatever. And the way this lab worked is you didn't draw, you spoke into a microphone, and they recorded what you said. So he said, I'm in there, and your eyes are closed when you do it in this particular lab. And he said, and I started seeing that it had something to do with government, and I started seeing like gold. And so the way this particular lab worked was you served as your own judge. So at the end, you're shown 4 possible pictures, and you have to pick which one you think you were trying to describe. So he was shown the 4 possible pictures, and he said, oh, the Kremlin, that's it, government, gold, and so on. So he got it right. So he and I are driving to Princeton, and he's telling me this story. And so I go into the room where the sender is going to go. So they had 2 rooms, one for the sender and one for the person who's supposed to be trying to be psychic. And the sender is looking at a television screen on which a picture pops up, either a picture or a short video. And the person who's trying to be psychic, in this case my father, is in another sound-shielded room, shielded from electromagnetic waves, etc., but talking into a microphone that the sender can hear. So I can hear him. Of course he can't hear me, because that would be cheating. And I can hear him. And he's talking, and he says, I see red, I see gold, It's the Kremlin again. I know it shouldn't be, but it is, and it was. I was looking at the Kremlin. So then we did a second session, and in this case, the target came up on the video screen that I was looking at, and it was a little clip from a movie of a guy in a white spacesuit with blue background. So he's just floating around in space in this white space with a blue background. And again, I can hear my father, he's in the other room, and he says, he's talking, and then he sort of would start narrowing in on what he thought, and he says, I see the painting The Blue Boy. I don't know if any of you know that painting, but it's blue and white. It's this boy, and I think he's in blue and a white background, or maybe he's in white. I guess he is in white, and it's a blue background. So very similar visually to what I was looking at. So he didn't say, I see a guy floating around in space in a white suit, but he said, I see the Blue Boy painting, which is very similar visually. So again, of course, when he was shown the 4 choices, as soon as he saw the one that was the right answer with the guy in the white spacesuit and the blue background, he said, that's it, the Blue Boy. So again, he got it right. He went 4 times and he got it right all 4 times. The reason that was important to me was because at this point I was still very skeptical. I had, as I said, just gotten involved in this work. And I thought, maybe they're pulling my leg. Maybe they're just trying to suck me in so that somebody who's got credentials in statistics will verify that this stuff is real. So maybe they're, using fraud of some kind. But I knew my own father wasn't cheating. So that really did kind of help pull me in to this whole thing, that experience early on. But I thought it was funny because he actually did name the Kremlin, but it was because he had seen it before as his target. So, okay, so in a minute I'm going to open it up for question and answer. There's just one other thing I wanted to say, and that is that one of the most frustrating things for me is the way the scientific community has dealt with this area. There are a group of people who call themselves skeptics, and I call them debunkers, because they do their best to make sure research in this area does not get funded, that it doesn't get published in traditional scientific journals, although that has changed recently, that it doesn't get taken seriously, and that young scholars are discouraged from working in this area because of the reputation it has for, an area you don't go there. So like I said, the fact that I already had tenure is what allowed me to do it, and also as a statistician, it's not quite the same as someone doing their own experiments. Statisticians look at data of any kind, so it's kind of a little more legitimate for a statistician. But it's very frustrating to me that the scientific community treats it that way, because I think whatever is going on here has much broader implications than just parapsychology. I think, for example, if it's impossible to really rule out these kinds of forms of communication, then all scientific experiments that are done could have an element of this to them. So for example, if an experimenter is trying to prove their cherished hypothesis, maybe they're communicating that to the participants in the experiment, and it's coming out the way the experimenter wants it to come out for that reason, and not because whatever it is actually works. So to me, the fact that the scientific community has pretty much ignored this area is shameful. It's a black mark on the scientific community, and I think it will eventually someday be seen that way. So, yes. So we will do that for question. We'll pass that around, but I'll repeat your question. She said, isn't it mainly the scientific community in the United States? For example, in Russia, they do take it seriously. Absolutely. And in the UK even, there was an endowment by Arthur Kessler to start a chair, which is basically a paid professorship, in parapsychology, and it was to go to any university in the UK that was willing to take it, and the University of Edinburgh in Scotland took it on, and they have now graduated a fair number of Ph.D. students in that program who have then gone to other universities in the UK and started their own programs. So there is a more active research community in the UK certainly than there is in the US. In the US, there's almost nothing going on at universities. So, okay, so let's switch to question and answer now, so go ahead, yeah.
Oh, I just want to thank you. Thank you so much for the beautiful program.
Thank you.